tomorrow everything changes. Perez Hilton is standing on the edge of the biggest legal showdown of his life, facing Blake Lively's powerful lawyers alone in a Las Vegas courtroom. And tonight, as the neon lights burn and the pressure mounts his world spirals into fear, exhaustion, and a desperate fight for survival. Perez Hilton sits in the suffocating heat of Las Vegas on the night before his most terrifying day, and every breath feels heavy with dread as the looming courtroom battle against Blake Lively's lawyers consumes his mind. He tells himself that he is strong, that he has prepared, that he has studied his filings, rehearsed his arguments, and convinced himself that his words will be enough. But deep down beneath the floral jacket, he has chosen as his armor, and beneath the forced smiles he flashes at strangers walking past him on the strip. There is a storm of panic spinning out of control, and it feels as though every neon light is mocking him. Every sound of the casino. Slot machines reminds him that his future is a gamble, and he cannot shake the weight of knowing that tomorrow he will not be facing just one attorney, but 3 seasoned fighters sent to destroy him in court. And as he waits for his mother to return from her slot machine ritual, he wonders how he has arrived at this moment, how the gossip blogger who once thrived on Hollywood scandals now finds himself the headline of a legal war that could reshape everything he has built. The heat presses into him, sweat gathering on his forehead, the brightness blinding his eyes so badly that he cannot even read the comments on his phone during a live stream, and he shifts from spot to spot looking for shade, for relief, for escape. But there is none. Because the real burning fire is inside his chest, where anxiety rattles like a drumbeat louder than the distant music of Vegas. And he remembers that only days ago he collapsed into sleep after 2 naps and 12 straight hours of rest, his body screaming for recovery, his brain short-circuited, and yet no matter how much he slept, the exhaustion clung to him like chains. He tells his audience that this must be trauma, that this must be his body, sounding alarms that he ignored for too long. And yet he cannot stop. He cannot rest because tomorrow the federal courthouse downtown will open its doors at precisely 1:30 p.m., and his name will be called into that cold chamber of judgment, and he will stand alone while Blake's attorneys move, in unison against him, like hunters circling their prey. And it is this image that replays in his mind so often that he mutters out loud, "Let go and let God," even though he does not believe in God, because faith in something, anything, is all he has. Left, he drinks coffee after coffee to fight his fatigue. But even caffeine cannot silence the yawns clawing their way out of his throat, nor the trembling of his hands, and every sip only worsens his anxiety, feeding the restless storm that keeps him awake at night, staring at the ceiling, imagining every possible outcome. He rehearses again. What he will say to the judge, what arguments might save him. But a voice deep inside keeps whispering that it may not matter, that no matter how hard he tries, the decision might already be written, and yet he tells himself he must fight. He must appeal if he loses. He cannot allow himself to be crushed without resistance. And this inner dialogue plays on repeat as he walks through the casino, searching for a quiet corner only to be assaulted by music chatter and the endless ringing of machines. Until finally he sits under the shaded structure he cannot pronounce, porte cochere, a fancy French word that slips clumsily from his tongue, and even here, there is no escape for every passerby is a reminder that life moves on easily for others while he stands frozen on the edge of ruin. He tries to laugh. He jokes with viewers about being tricked into saying silly names, but beneath every smile there is fear. Every laugh a fragile mask, and when someone asks what his mother thinks, he admits that she does not understand who Blake Lively even is, that she knows only enough to pray for him, and somehow her simple faith brings him comfort. He does not share for himself. He lights candles, he whispers intentions into the air. He talks about karma and energy, as though willing the universe to balance the scales tomorrow. And all the while, the neon glow of Vegas wraps around him like a mirage, whispering that he lives in a city of luck and chance. But tomorrow, luck will not save him. Tomorrow, only his voice, his filings, his courage will stand between him and defeat. And as the minutes crawl by on this suffocating night, he tries to remind himself that he has perspective, that he has gratitude, that he still has his health and his children and his mother. But even with those blessings, the fear of what is coming weighs heavier than the desert heat. And he knows that when he lays down to sleep tonight, his mind will not rest, because the clock is ticking, and tomorrow the showdown begins. Perez Hilton feels the night stretching endlessly before him, as though time itself has slowed to trap him in a cage of worry. And no matter how, many times he tells himself to breathe, to stay calm, to focus on gratitude. The truth is that his body is betraying him, every muscle tight, every nerve sparking like wires on the fritz. And he keeps hearing the same sound in his head over and over. The clanging slot machines, the bells, the drums, the endless rhythm of Las Vegas that once felt like excitement, but now feels like torment, as though the city itself is mocking him. You gamble with your future, you gamble with your name, and now the odds are stacked against you. He paces under the lights of the Strip, his phone in his hand, reading questions from viewers who ask if Blake Lively will be present tomorrow, and the very thought sends his pulse racing, because even if she is not there, her shadow looms. Her power is felt. Her lawyers stand as her voice, as her weapon, and he will have to look into their eyes and speak alone with no team to back him. No one to whisper strategies, no one to shield him, and that realization claws at his mind the same way exhaustion claws at his body. He yawns again, fighting off the heaviness in his eyes while the caffeine burns in his chest and makes his hands tremble worse. And he knows that the imbalance between fatigue and adrenaline is dangerous. It makes his thoughts scatter. It makes his emotions spill. And yet he cannot stop, because if he lets go for even a moment, if he allows the exhaustion to swallow him, he fears he will not wake strong enough to face tomorrow. He remembers his live stream earlier, when he walked the Strip trying to look calm, trying to make it fun for viewers, only to end up blinded by the light and lost in his own panic, muttering curses to himself as he shifted, desperately searching for a shaded spot, because even the smallest detail, like not being able to read comments, felt like the universe was pushing him down, and he told his viewers he was melting in the heat even under the porte cochere, and that simple truth was more than just about weather. It was a confession. He was melting inside too, melting under pressure, under scrutiny, under fear. And though he tries to make jokes, calling Blake names, laughing at silly word games from viewers, the laughter never reaches his eyes, because deep inside he is terrified that this is it, that this is the beginning of the end. Tomorrow, the judge may hear his words, nod politely, and still side with the polished three-lawyer team across the aisle, and in that moment, his voice would be drowned out, his filings swept aside, his effort reduced to dust, and he knows he cannot accept that he has already said it on camera. If he loses, he will appeal. He will not surrender. But even the word appeal feels like another mountain too high to climb. Another stretch of endless nights like this one where sleep is impossible and anxiety devours him whole. He remembers telling his viewers that he had not been this anxious in years, that it felt like his brain was short-circuited and still sparking. Back and forth, unable to rest, unable to focus. And as he spoke those words, he could feel the weight of truth in them. He was snippy, short-tempered, clashing with his mother over small things as they drove together, and he hated himself for it. Because he loves her deeply and knows she is only here to support him, to pray for him, to sit quietly and remind him that he is not alone even if she does not understand the case. And so he clings to her presence even as he knows she cannot fight for him. He thinks about tomorrow again. The sterile courtroom, the judge's expression, the rows of wooden benches where strangers might sit curious to watch him stand against Hollywood power, and he imagines the silence when his name is called. The echo of his footsteps as he approaches the table, his floral jacket standing out in the sea of gray suits, and he wonders, will that make him seem brave or foolish? Will the judge see confidence or desperation? He tries not to care, but in moments like this, every detail feels like destiny, and he cannot escape the thought that image matters. Tone matters, every blink, every pause matters, and that pressure weighs on him like an iron chain pulling him down, and yet he keeps repeating to himself, perspective, gratitude, luck, energy, karma, prayer. Even though he doubts, even though he questions, even though faith feels foreign on his tongue, he repeats these words like a mantra, because without them, he fears he would collapse. He thinks of the audience who still watches him, who still believes in him, who says they will come to the courthouse tomorrow, and he feels a flicker of strength that maybe he is not as alone as he thinks. Maybe when he walks into that courtroom there will be friendly eyes in the crowd, strangers who want to see him stand tall against the odds, and that thought is the only comfort he clings to as the clock ticks slowly toward midnight in the city of lights and shadows. Perez sat in the stillness of his living room, yet the word stillness was only a cruel illusion, because inside his head there was no silence. There was a deafening storm of thoughts, doubts, and worst-case scenarios looping endlessly like a broken record that refused to stop spinning. And the strange thing was that his body betrayed him too, because his legs twitched. His fingers drummed uncontrollably against the coffee table. His throat burned as though he had swallowed fire, and yet none of it made sense, because he was simply a man waiting for a court date, waiting to walk into a room where lawyers in expensive suits would try to slice his reputation to pieces, but the magnitude of it made everything surreal. It was not just any case. It was Blake Lively, and the sheer weight of her name, her Hollywood polish, her carefully curated image of elegance and motherhood and grace contrasted so violently with the way Perez had been painted. A loudmouth, a gossip, a troublemaker, a man who had poked the bear one too many times and was now paying for it with his sanity. And he thought about that word, sanity, over and over, wondering if he had already lost it, wondering if maybe the last few weeks had cracked him open beyond repair, because each morning felt like the last time he would ever have peace, and each night felt like a countdown to disaster. And as the hours passed, the city around him seemed to mock him with its rhythm, the laughter spilling from nearby bars, the late-night traffic humming like an endless reminder that the world kept moving, regardless of whether he drowned or swam, and he resented it. He resented that people could go on dates, could drink cocktails, could argue about football games, while his entire existence was about to be dragged under the harshest light imaginable. And it was not just about him, it was about his children, about the whispers they might face at school, about the way other parents might look at him, about whether tomorrow would plant a scar that none of them could erase. And he felt powerless in a way he had never felt even in the lowest moments of his career. Because at least then he could fight back. He could post. He could shout. He could reclaim his space. But now he was boxed in by rules, by motions filed by attorneys who spoke a language designed to confuse and intimidate, and all he could do was wait until that clock ticked over and he was called to stand before strangers who would judge every syllable that left his lips, and he tried to prepare, mentally rehearsing imaginary answers to questions he did not yet know, framing sentences in his head that might make him sound thoughtful or careful or credible. But each time he tripped over his own words inside his imagination, and if he could not speak clearly in his own living room, how could he possibly survive under oath in front of cameras, microphones, and the cold stare of lawyers paid to destroy him? And yet even in that fear, there was a strange ember of defiance glowing somewhere deep in his chest, because if they wanted to humiliate him, if they wanted to drag him across the coals for daring to exist, for daring to speak, then he would not collapse easily. He would show up. He would stare back. He would remind them that he was not some voiceless pawn, and maybe that ember would be enough to carry him through. And still the hours dragged on. Midnight arrived. Then 1 a.m., then 2, and still he sat wide-eyed, unable to force himself into rest, because every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of the courtroom, saw himself cornered, unable to answer. Saw Blake Lively sitting in perfect silence, her team smirking. As they watched him stumble, and those visions jolted him awake, heart racing, palms damp, and he wondered if sleep was even possible anymore. Wondered if maybe tomorrow he would walk in already broken from exhaustion, and that would be the cruelest irony of all, because they would not even need to defeat him. He would have defeated himself, and the thought nearly crushed him until he remembered that he had survived worse. Maybe not legally, but emotionally, professionally, he had been ripped apart. By tabloids, by celebrities, by audiences who cheered his downfall, and somehow he had always clawed his way back. And maybe this was just another cycle. Maybe tomorrow would be hell, but he could not let it be the end, not when his children needed him, not when his story was still unfinished. And so he sat there, trembling, sweating, whispering silent prayers to no one in particular, and clinging desperately to the hope that when the sun rose, he would find a version of himself strong enough to endure whatever Blake Lively and her army had planned, because the truth was that survival was the only option he had left. And so the night stretched on as the city outside continued its restless hum, and Perez sat in his dimly lit apartment with the weight of everything pressing down on him, because this was no longer just about a court date or a subpoena or some legal technicality. It had become something far larger, something that reached into the core of who he was and what he had built. And as the minutes ticked by, He could not escape the truth that tomorrow would be the moment where his words, his choices, and his resilience would be tested in a way they never had before. He thought back to the beginning, to the days when blogging was new, when social media was not yet the empire it is now, and how back then he had been bold, fearless, sometimes reckless, but always determined to carve out a voice in the chaos of celebrity culture. He remembered the highs of being ahead of the curve, the power of breaking stories before anyone else, the thrill of seeing his name trend, and the adrenaline of feeling like he mattered in the cultural conversation. But he also remembered the lows, the mistakes, the controversies, the apologies, the late nights filled with regret, and the countless times he wondered if it was all worth it. And now here he was, all those years later, facing something that felt even heavier than those early storms, because this was not just about public backlash or online outrage. This was about a courtroom, about lawyers and judges and transcripts and evidence, and about how his own words could be twisted and turned against him by people with far more resources, far more influence, and far more at stake than he could ever imagine. He imagined the faces that would be in that courtroom tomorrow, the polished attorneys speaking with precision and confidence, the reporters waiting outside, eager to capture every expression, every detail, every soundbite that could become a headline. He pictured the publicists strategizing behind the scenes, already drafting statements no matter what the outcome would be. And in the middle of it all, there would be him sitting in a chair answering questions under oath. His every word recorded, his every pause analyzed, his every emotion scrutinized, and he wondered how he would endure it, whether he could keep calm, whether he could stay composed, whether he could find a way to be honest and strong without giving them what they wanted to use against him, because he knew that was the game here. It was not just about facts, it was about narrative. It was about control. It was about who could spin the story in their favor and who would be left painted as the villain. And Perez knew better than most how stories could be spun. He had spent his career shaping narratives about others, and now he was on the other side of it, the subject, instead of the storyteller, and the irony was not lost on him. And as he sat there staring at the ceiling, he thought about the people who still supported him, the audience that still tuned in, the voices online that told him to keep going, the friends who checked in quietly and reminded him he was not alone. He thought about his children too, about the responsibility he had to them, about the example he wanted to set, about showing them that even when life becomes overwhelming, even when the odds are stacked against you, even when the world seems eager to tear you down, you must face it head on and not run from it. And that thought gave him strength. Not a blazing fire of confidence, but a steady quiet. Resolve that, maybe, just maybe, he could walk into that courtroom tomorrow and hold his head high, even if he was terrified, even if his heart was pounding, even if every part of him wanted to be anywhere else. He could still show up, and that mattered. He tried to imagine what tomorrow would feel like the moment he woke up, the drive to the courthouse, the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallways, the sight of the judge walking in the raised hands as oaths were taken. He thought about the questions he might be asked, the strategies the lawyers might use to corner him, the way they might bring up past mistakes and throw them in his face. And he wondered if he was ready for that, if he was ready to own his past without letting it define his present. He thought about how Blake Lively herself might be watching, not necessarily in person, but through her team, through the transcripts, through the updates, and how in some way this entire battle was about her power, her image, her need to silence narratives that she could not control. And Perez knew that standing up in that space, even if he was small compared to the machine that surrounded her, was in itself an act of defiance. He thought about how this might all be remembered years from now, whether it would be a footnote in his career or a defining chapter, whether people would say he was broken by it, or that he found a way to stand tall, and the uncertainty of it all filled him with dread, and yet also with a strange clarity, because for the first time in a long time, everything felt real and raw and unfiltered. No spin, no clickbait, no staged persona. Just him against the system, him against the weight of celebrity power, him against his own fear. And as the night gave way to the early signs of morning, he finally rose from the couch, walked to the window, and looked out at the faint glow on the horizon, the city slowly waking to a new day. And he whispered to himself that he would not break that. No matter what happened tomorrow, he would walk into that courtroom and face it. And in that whisper, there was no certainty of victory, no guarantee of safety, but there was resolve, and sometimes resolve was enough. and as the first light of dawn touched his face, Perez Hilton closed. His eyes took a deep breath and prepared himself for the day that would change everything. In the end, what we are left with is not just another Hollywood feud, not just another headline that burns brightly for a week before fading into the abyss, but something much larger. Something that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about loyalty, betrayal, power, and truth. This saga with Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, Taylor Swift, Ryan Reynolds, and the army of lawyers and journalists circling around them is not simply about lawsuits or subpoenas. It is about image. It is about reputation. It is about who gets to write the story and who is left at the mercy of someone else's version of events. We see careers teetering on the edge. We see friendships shattering under the weight of discovery. We see private words dragged out under courtroom lights and turned into public spectacle. What once felt secure is now fragile. What once seemed untouchable is now vulnerable. And that is why this story matters, because it reflects the world beyond Hollywood where power struggles and public perception dictate outcomes as much as the facts themselves do. Blake Lively faces a moment of reckoning not just in a courtroom but in the court of public opinion, where her legacy is debated in real time. Justin Baldoni carries the banner of vindication, but with it comes the burden of being both plaintiff and target. Taylor Swift has remained silent, yet her silence itself speaks volumes, and Ryan Reynolds finds himself tethered to a drama that even his wit cannot spin into something lighthearted. What we are watching is not just entertainment, it is history in motion, a collision of ego, ambition, and consequence. And when the dust finally settles, the names and reputations caught up in this storm will never be the same again.